Welcome back to Crime Chronicles. Today we delve into the world of Christy Kinahan, known as the Dapper Don, and his rise from the streets of Dublin to the peak of the international underworld. Stay tuned as we look at how Christy's keen eye for an opportunity would take him from taxi driver to the boss of a billion-dollar cartel in just 20 years. According to his most recent British passport, Christy Kinahan was born on March 23rd of 1957 in St. Teresa's Gardens, Dublin, a southern part of the inner city. As with most information available about Christy Kinahan, his place of birth is in dispute, having been listed differently on previous passports. One fact that can't be questioned is that Christy Kinahan started and remains a key part of one of the world's most dominant cartels, a $1 billion business with links that span the globe. In the early 1980s, Christy Kinahan worked as a taxi driver in Dublin. He had a young family and was determined to elevate himself, keeping his eyes and ears open for an opportunity to improve his situation. In 1979, Russia had invaded Afghanistan, and as a result, a huge amount of heroin from Afghanistan found its way to Europe. It didn't take long for the UK to have a big heroin problem. The bulk of the heroin from Afghanistan was peddled by notorious Irish drug dealer Larry Dunn. His gang flooded the city streets with cheap and abundant heroin, creating tens of thousands of young addicts in the early 1980s. It was a perfect storm, a ready-made market. 1 minute in the early 80s, there was no heroin available, and the next minute, it was everywhere. It devastated the inner city and deprived communities. Very quickly, whole families were on drugs. As a taxi driver, the eyes and ears of the street, Christy Kinahan saw all of this, and when Larry Dunn was arrested in 1983, Christy spotted his opportunity. Former Garda Assistant Commissioner Michael O'Sullivan has said that Christy began preying on Dublin's vulnerable drug users at the height of the city's heroin epidemic in the 1980s. Christy set himself up in Fairview in a quiet apartment block, which he used as an operations centre for distributing drugs. His distribution model had kept him almost invisible to Gardaí. He had been only on their radar as a low-level fraudster, mainly known for bouncing checks. With his criminal success came the trappings of wealth. The fancy clothes and sports cars earned him the nickname of the Dapper Don. Gardaí started putting two and two together and realised the Dapper Don must be involved in something more lucrative than low-level fraud. His early efforts at drug dealing would come to a sudden halt on September 14th of 1986, when a sting operation by Gardaí, which saw them gain entry to his apartment by posing as electricians, found him surrounded by heroin valued at £117,000, and he was subsequently jailed for 6 years. There is speculation that this light sentence was one of the biggest motivating factors for Christy Kinahan. He was caught with a large amount of a terrible drug, and yet he barely got a slap on the wrist. Maybe a longer sentence at the start of his criminal career would have been a better deterrent. Although he had been arrested and spent time in prison, Christy Kinahan now knew that his future lay in large-scale drug trafficking. However, he continued to harbour a secret rage against the man he blamed for his incarceration, Raymond Salinger. Christy was convinced his former underling was responsible for giving information about him to the police. The innocent Dubliner fled the city after Christy's arrest and made a life for himself in the UK. But as the years passed, and with Christy now living on the continent, Raymond eventually returned to Dublin in 2002 when his wife became sick with cancer. However, Raymond crucially underestimated Christy Kinahan's bitter lust for revenge. In 2003, while enjoying a pint in Farrell's pub in the south inner city, a gunman walked in and shot Raymond 4 times in the chest. It's widely accepted that Raymond was the first victim of the Kinahan cartel, most likely killed by a hitman on orders from Christy and his son Daniel. He had waited 17 years to avenge himself against the man he blamed for him going down for his first long stretch in prison. This was an early indication of how Christy Kinahan could bear a grudge and what he would do to those against whom he bore a grudge. After laying low following his release from the 1986 drug charge sentence, he was again arrested in 1993, charged with possession of stolen checks. In a stunning misstep, Kinahan was bailed on the stolen check charges and promptly fled the UK. He managed to re-enter the UK, but in 1997 he was arrested at a family funeral in Dublin on the stolen check charges, denied bail, and eventually jailed for 4 years. Christy Kinahan spent his time wisely whilst in prison, studying for 2 degrees, and refused early release in 2001 to complete a degree. While in prison, he also learned to speak both Spanish and Russian, 2 languages that would come in very handy once his cartel started making international connections. After being released from prison in the early 2000s, he moved to the continent, basing himself in Spain. It was during this time that he is suspected of setting up drug routes into Western Europe for Mexican and Colombian cartels, as well as the Russian mafia. Kinahan and his cartel started moving large shipments of drugs into Europe and onwards to the UK and Irish Republic during this time. Christy was directing this international drug supply operation from his €6 million villa in Estepona on the Costa del Sol. In 2006, an international investigation was established, looking into the Kinahan cartel and their associates. This investigation, Operation Shovel, ramps up in 2008 when the cartel is suspected of being involved in the shooting of Dubliner Paddy Doyle near Marbella. Operation Shovel leads to significant cooperation between Irish, Spanish and British law enforcement, but spreads across Europe to the US, Brazil, UAE, China, Panama and the Dominican Republic. This investigation and the cooperation between international forces would see Kinahan questioned and charged with a number of offences, mainly linked to money laundering, though nothing substantial would stick. Christy Kinahan's home was raided by Spanish police in 2010. He spent a few months in jail, though no charges were brought. Another instance that seemed to offer Kinahan a green light to continue his criminality. In 2012, Operation Shovel effectively concluded, without any significant targets being imprisoned, despite Christy Kinahan being among those arrested for questioning during the inquiry. While Christy was being put under pressure during the Operation Shovel years, his sons, Daniel and Christy Jr., effectively became the key figures of the Kinahan cartel, responsible for its day-to-day running and its continued growth. Christy Kinahan secretly began his efforts to establish a new life in Zimbabwe, presenting himself as a British businessman, Christopher Vincent, working as a manager, owner and consultant in the aviation sector. The Hutch-Kinahan feud would ramp up during 2015 and 2016, firstly with Gary Hutch being shot dead in Spain, and then with the Regency Hotel boxing event, an attempt on Daniel Kinahan's life that would see David Burns shot dead. By this time, Christy had finally settled in Dubai. The feuding and pressure from the authorities would lead to the complete relocation of the cartel leadership to Dubai, following Christy's lead. In April of 2022, the US Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, travelled to Dublin to unveil a package of financial and travel sanctions against the men they say are at the apex of the Kinahan cartel. Rewards of $5 million have been offered for information leading to the arrest and jailing of Christy Kinahan or his sons, Daniel and Christopher Jr. Sanctions have been put in place that restrict international travel, access to money and businesses connected to Christy and his sons. US authorities have acknowledged that Christy and the senior Kinahan figures have been looking to move their base of operations again, as a potential extradition from Dubai to the Irish Republic looks like it might become a reality. Locations like Iran Russia, and some Asian nations have all been floated as possible options. It seems like the race is on for Christy Kinahan to make one final Hail Mary move, one that would allow him to see out his days in freedom rather than staring at the four walls of a prison cell. Thank you for joining us today on Crime Chronicles. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more crazy crime content.